everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Joyce Slater. I'm an associate professor of human nutrition here in agriculture, and I'm part of the Food Systems Research Group, which is headed up by Dr. Ian Davidson Hunt, who unfortunately can't be here today, and he asked me to tell you a bit about the Food Systems Research Group and the speaker series, which I left my notes in the printer, so I'm going to totally outlook this here. But we've got a speaker series coming up, and you've probably all gotten an email from Christine at the back, who organizes these. Wave, Christine, thank you. Yes, yes, yes. So, you know, look for those emails that say Food Systems Research Group. The one advertising this event had the next talks listed on it, so maybe go back and have a look at those. And Christine, what's the next one?
Actually, October 31st, it's joining the Food Systems Research Group in the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences and Tricarbo.
Oh! Here we go, the preview. Yes.
And our anticipating one at the end of January, and then we have one out of the Department of History, Sarah Elvin is giving a talk.
Right. On.
And that's,
She's doing, I think, like sort of commercial food history.
yes,
Kind of.
Hillsborough reasons.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a great series. So great to came up to this, come up to the rest of them. We'll promote them widely. But today, I'm really excited to be introducing Dr. Danielle Gallegos from Queensland University of Technology. Danielle and I met at a couple of conferences, one in Italy and one in Spain, and we quickly realized we had an awful lot in common. So, yeah, Danielle decided to come and visit us here in Winnipeg, which is absolutely fantastic considering we're having all this unseasonably cold weather right now. So, I'm going to tell you a bit about Danielle. She's a social nutritionist and professor at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, where she's the discipline lead for nutrition and dietetics. She's also the director for international engagement and recruitment. Danielle coordinates the dietetic honors students, and she's a fellow of the Dietitian Association of Australia. And she's worked in all areas of nutrition and dietetics, including acute care, food service, private practice, and for the last 15 years in public health and nutrition. That's my area too. So she teaches public and community nutrition and undertakes research related to the nexus between nutrition and social justice. So we're going to be hearing about that today. I'm very, very excited to hear that. Her special area of interest are developing nutrition and dietetics as a profession in Vietnam, food security, food literacy, and supporting breastfeeding through the use of innovative technologies. And she currently supervises 10 PhD students, 3 of whom are from Vietnam. So I'm going to stop there. And
thank you, Joyce. Thank you very much. I'm going to start with a few acknowledgements before I begin. And the first acknowledgement is to Joyce Slater for her remarkable hospitality for the University of Manitoba as well. I'd also just like to acknowledge Sulawesi and the people that have recently lost their lives over the weekend due to the major earthquake and tsunami, and to acknowledge that our thoughts and prayers are with Indonesia and those families. The other acknowledgement I'm going to do, which is what we do in Australia, is an acknowledgement of country, and to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of where we now stand, and to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And to also acknowledge, though, that Indigenous peoples have a unbroken connection to the land and sea, and certainly in Australia, addressing the issues of sovereignty and treaties is long overdue. I was very fortunate to visit the Human Rights Museum over the weekend, and this I thought epitomised the Indigenous perspective. So symbolising the land on which all people depend for survival, people must keep the dish clean, take from it only what is needed and protect it for future and current generations. And that's our remit as well. I want to acknowledge my co-researchers, and you'll see there's a little picture there of there. That was in Italy. So there's a large body of researchers, national and internationally, that I work with in this area. And I have 2 PhD students that are particularly working in food insecurity, one in household food insecurity in Australia, and the other one looking at food insecurity in the Mekong Delta. And this is where I come from. So I thought I'd better give you a bit of perspective about where I come from. So Brisbane is subtropical. It's a wee bit bit chilly for me here at the moment. And we're just heading into spring. So this is large tracts of country. This is the remote Australia, more remote Queensland up here and remote Queensland in here. We've done some work in Arakoon, which is on this side. The barge with the food comes around this tip here and takes approximately 3 weeks to arrive. So food in remote communities in Australia is a particular issue. I'm not talking about remote Australia, I'm really talking about urban household food insecurity. So we're going to have a little bit of a chat about what being food insecure means, how food insecure are we in Australia, where does food literacy fit in, what is the reality of living in a food insecure household and the neoliberal response, and where food literacy might fit into that. You've probably all seen this before. This is the definition that I like to use because it's the latest definition. It encompasses food and nutrition security, so it's not just about food security. It's talking about sufficient quantity and sufficient quality. In high-income countries, that's the perspective that we need to really take. We're not just talking about enough food to eat, we're talking about enough healthy food to eat. 4 pillars: availability, access, utilisation, and sustainability and stability. But a human rights approach says you need the acknowledgement of need, and that's the issue that we have in Australia. We haven't got an acknowledgement that food insecurity is actually an issue. Food literacy effectively falls into the utilisation arm, which is how do people make meals from food, get the food into a form that's actually digestible and fun and pleasurable, as well as how is the food utilised within the body. So it's got two meanings. Why are we interested? In high-income countries, we know that there are some serious outcomes related to food insecurity. In adults, it's associated with increased ill health, increased use of the health system, which kind of gets the economists going because it's all about the dollar. We've got increased depression and anxiety, increased incidence of chronic conditions, and overweight and obesity in women. For children, we've got increased ill health, increased use of the health system, increased depression and anxiety. We have increased behavioural issues, externalising associated with transient food insecurity, and internalising associated with persistent food insecurity. We've got associations with academic outcomes, social engagement, and risk of developmental delay. I'll just add this a little bit here because the most recent Child Wellbeing in Rich Countries report, which reports generally on those children in higher income countries, Australia doesn't get a mention because we have no data. So, this is an issue, particularly in high income countries, where the lack of data is actually quite influential and government interventions are actually done. So how food insecure are we? Australia asks the one question. We ask, in the last 12 months, were there any times that you ran out of food and couldn't afford to buy any more? There are no indications of severity. It's about access and it's about affordability only as one dimension. It's not routinely collected. So we're talking here about it being collected in 2004, 2005, not collected in 2008 because of the food crisis, and then and then collected again in 2011, 2012 as a part of our National Nutrition Survey, which, like Canada, is not done very often. At a population level, we think it underestimates by about 5 to 8 percentage points. So when we asked this question in the most recent survey, we said 4% of Australians were food insecure. It hasn't changed. Government goes, it's only those very poor people who are food insecure, so we don't need to worry about it. If we say it's underestimating by about 5%, then we're looking at about 9%. So we're thinking that actually food insecurity in Australia is probably comparable to food insecurity in the US and food insecurity in Canada. The 22% refers to urban Indigenous communities. The 31%, using the same question, refers to remote Indigenous communities. So obviously we've got a problem here. Over a wee little while, we've been working on a new tool that we've been developing for the Australian context, because we want to make sure that we're actually trying to measure all 4 pillars of food insecurity, not just the affordability or the access, the availability, the access pillar. So we've developed, it's still in its infancy, we're doing some validation at the moment, but it seems to be quite comparable to the USDA tool. And we're asking actually about the pillars here. So you actually we ask if there's been enough to eat and enough nutritious food to eat, and we ask what are the reasons why that might not happen, and then we go through some of the behaviours as well. So the data I'm going to present now, I try to make a funding declaration whenever I present, and this was actually research done by Second Bite, which is a food rescue agency, through a philanthropic donation by Rowley and Judy Patterson in memory of their son. So we did a Facebook survey of 1,010 households or people, and it was very broad, it was across Australia, a bit of a focus on Queensland, but we found that 1 in 3 households were food insecure. And this is not going to be surprising. Those that were food insecure, same thing. They were mainly renters, they had lower levels of education, they were earning less, and they were typically around about a bit younger than the ones that were food secure, and a lot of them were either living with others and living alone. So when we ask the single question, 20%, so 4% in the general population. This sample is low to middle income, probably a little bit lower on the income scale than the general census survey would do. But 20% of those are saying, using that one question, we were food insecure. When we actually used our tool, it was 1 in 3 households. So 1 in 3 households were saying there was not enough to eat. And you'll see here that we've got, this is for adults, so of those adults, at least fortnightly, 50% of adults were limiting the variety of what they ate, 43% cutting the size of their meals, going without food or changing the types of food that you eat to pay other expenses, feeling stressed, eating less than you thought you would, about a third, relying on others to provide food, and then we've got here about going hungry, about 1 in 5, and typically using emergency food relief as the last port of call. Very few of them are doing that fortnightly, at least fortnightly. This was a bit of a shock for us because in Australia we can't go 4 children are getting enough food. But in actual fact, what we're finding here of those food insecure households, 6% of them have gone hungry. So 6% of Australian children in the land of plenty have actually gone hungry. So that was a bit of a wake-up call for us, and this warrants some further investigation and further research. You can see that we have got reliance on breakfast programs, and we've got reliance on, and we've got 6% not eating for a whole day. So where does food literacy fit into all of this? Well, we have a look. This is that food pillar comparison that I showed you. So if we have a look here, we'll see the 2 areas where food literacy potentially fits in are competing costs and food's too expensive, and then unsure of what to buy, unsure of preparing, cooking, no food storage, lack of kitchen equipment, no time. 25% of food insecure households were saying they had no time. 15% of food secure households were saying the same thing. So we've got possibilities of where food literacy could fit into this equation. So coming back, here's the definition of food literacy that Helen Vidgen and myself have developed. And you'll see here that it encompasses 4 main areas: planning and management, selection, eating and preparation. That's influences certainty that you're certainly going to get food, that you've got a choice about what types of food that you can eat, and that you can derive pleasure, and the pleasure is the one that we usually miss out on, you can get pleasure from that, and that will actually influence diet quality. We've got no research yet that actually draws a direct link between food literacy and diet quality. So if you're looking for a research program, that could be one of them. But note that it's all contextual. So this food literacy occurs in a context of social determinants. So a context of poverty, context of social exclusion and social support. It also happens in the context of your early childhood experiences with food and the food supply. So we can go a bit deeper into these. We've got planning and managing as one of the elements. So that's prioritising money and time for food, planning your food intake, making feasible food choices. We've got selection, accessing food through multiple sources and knowing the advantages and disadvantages of those sources, determining what is in a food product and how to store it and use it, judging the quality of the food. And we've got preparing, making a good tasting meal from whatever is available. Notice there's not a necessarily healthy meal, but making a good tasting meal from whatever is available, knowing how to adapt recipes and having a repertoire, basic skills around food handling and food hygiene. And then it's about eating, understanding that food is important for your well-being, demonstrating your personal awareness of managing food intake and knowing your needs, and eating in a social way. I want you to meet Judy. Judy here is homeless. She lives under a bridge in Brisbane, but extraordinarily food literate. Judy has a family of people that she caters for. They're all her friends that live with her under the same bridge. She will procure food from a supermarket without them knowing that she's procured food. And usually that's a loaf of bread and barbecue chicken. I'm not quite sure how she can procure the barbecue chicken, but she can. And then that will feed everybody under the bridge for at least a couple of days. Then she'll actually go the rounds of the food relief agencies. So she'll go and actually visit one of the welfare agencies and get the soup kitchen that they have available. Then she'll go and get the voucher from the other one. Then she knows how to work that system. And in doing that, she can feed herself, but not only herself, but also the people that she lives with on a really regular basis. She's extraordinarily food literate. Now, you can't say that she's not food literate because she's actually doing all of those things that we said made up a food literate person. And yet when you look at what she's eating, some of us who are in the nutrition and dietetic area will go, well, that's not very healthy. Come on, we want to get, do a little bit better here. We would argue, actually, she's extraordinarily food literate. So, what I want to go through now is then, are food insecure households food literate? And the argument I'm going to say is they are very food literate. So, if we think about the planning stage, food security is a managed process. We have a range of coping strategies that are used to avoid or delay hunger. Rhonda, who's doing the PhD that I spoke about, we're actually exploring this a little bit more. She's using the livelihoods framework. Most of those coping strategies for many food insecure families have become adaptive. So we like to call it resilient coping, or what did we say before? Adaptive resilience. Thank you. Still a bit jet lagged. Adaptive resilience. So it's actually adapting to the situation and being resilient at the same time. So they'll, for example, identify where to shop, and they're shopping at different stores based on the price. They'll buy in bulk. They'll catch foods on sale as a collective. So we'll band together and get those foods on sale. We'll ration items to purchase within a fortnightly pay cycle, based on need. So we get to the end of the fortnightly cycle, we might be rationing certain things. You might prioritise food items based on what the children need. Remember, children are protected for as long as possible. In the US, utilise food coupons with maximum effect. We don't have food coupons in Australia, so we can't use that. The other thing that we have to remember then for food insecure families is, or families living in disadvantage, that prioritising money for food is not simple. So we've got stories of women, and they're all women, on the phone talking to the electricity company, trying to argue for a payment plan because I need to pay for the school excursion that's happening next week. Then they will get on, we have Centrelink, which is our welfare agency, to talk about can I have a loan, for $500 because, so they're actually very adept at figuring out what to pay when. The food budget is the only part of the household budget that's flexible. I can stretch it for as long as I shrink it and contract, shrink it and expand it whenever I need to. So if I've got an electricity bill coming in or a heating bill, for example, would be astronomical, especially during winter. If that's coming in, then I know that I've got to pull back on the food a little bit. So we're going to prioritise having shelter and utilities and possibly petrol before food. So they're actually doing very, very well with respect to doing that, and prioritising money for food then becomes a little bit trickier. So this is an example here. This is a quote. If we're struggling for food, it's the first thing that goes. We would go back to sausages. Now I understand that's hot dogs or smokies. Hot dogs or smokies. We're not talking, good sausages. We're talking hot dogs or smokies. $8 for 20 sausages is something, cheap meal for 4 people. It's foods my kids will eat. There's no hesitation. I can put it on bread and feel quite happy and lucky. No curries, no vegetables, just a good old sausage on bread. So the kids are going to eat it. There's no waste. I know they're going to eat it. I know they're going to be full. It's high fat, so they're going to be full for a little bit longer as well. And that's the reality. So prioritising money for food, they have prioritised it. It's just that the food has to be reasonably cheap and not wasted. So when we have a look then at selection and preparation, we've also got evidence that low-income households are more likely to cook foods at home. Whenever I get up and do this presentation, or a presentation around food insecurity in Australia, I usually have somebody in the audience who goes, yeah, but I eat out takeaway all the time. And I'm like, actually, no, that's not the case. People on high incomes eat out a lot, people on low incomes tend not to. Oh, they're spending all their money on cigarettes and alcohol and gambling. Yeah, but actually people on high incomes are spending more of their dollar on cigarettes, alcohol, and gambling. So they're actually eating at home more often, and they're cooking dishes that are cheap and filling. They're prioritising quantity and satiety over quality. That takes food literacy to do that. We know in Aboriginal communities in Australia, for example, that we've got families that are definitely prioritising what will fill the kids up rather than what is of high quality, because that high quality food is really expensive. The Canadian dollar and the Australian dollar are about par, so a bag of oranges may be up to $15 for a bag of oranges. So, why would I? It's just not affordable. They would eat nutritionally sound but socially devalued foods. So we might be talking there about the inside bits of animals, maybe, or tripe is a good old favourite for old people in Australia. Nobody under the age of probably over 40 would eat that anymore. They're not 50 now. Making use of foods that can be frozen and stored, using leftovers, stretching the food, make it last longer, so extending it. Removing spoiled areas or insects from food to extend its usability, using foods that were beyond the expiry date, cutting down on the variety of fruits and vegetables to only those that are most affordable and filling and keep the longest. Potatoes, carrots, root vegetables. I'll put this quote up because then we think, well, okay, that's the situation for when you're food insecure. What happens when you get a little bit of money in? Well, nutrition's not the first thing on the agenda. In this particular household, when the tax return came in, they were able to actually, get all the things done that they needed to get done. And if you look at this, UTV, and then some food shopping, which was so much fun. But not like before when it was just a chore, but now it was a lot of fun. The kids just went, Mum, can we get that? And I was like, yeah, you can get that, that's okay. Probably wasn't too nutritious for a couple of weeks, but it was a lot of fun. Fun food. You have to forego fun when the money is tight. So I think as nutritionists and dietitians in particular, we need to remember that food is not only about the nutrients that it delivers, it's also about the pleasure that it can give. And if I get a little bit of money, I'm not necessarily going to go buy a bag of apples or fruit and veg. I might go and have some fun for a little while. So what about preparation and eating? So in a lot of disadvantaged households, we have what we call household caves. So housing may not be stable. I may be moving housing a lot. I might be having a lot of people come and go from the house. I'm not quite sure who may be present in the household at any one time. Maybe a lot of noise in the household. So there's some evidence to show that if you're living in a neighbourhood where there's a lot of noise, you'll turn up the noise in the house to kind of provide white noise to blank out what's the noise from outside. There's stresses of role overload. So as parents, you may be trying to hold down a job or 2 jobs, and that may be low paying. You're trying to be a parent, you're trying to actually be the financial manager of the household, so there's lots of roles. You may want changes in the size of your household to improve your economic viability. So you might have people move in, you might take in boarders, or you might move families together, you might live with aunts and uncles or bring cousins together in order to increase economic viability. Demands for childcare at irregular hours. So I'm going to prioritise childcare. It might mean I might need to pick up my child and take them to grandma's, and then pick them up from grandma's and take them to aunties, and then pick them up from aunties and bring them home. Jobs that require longer commutes. Heads of households engage in non-standard employment. And so what we have then is, where's the time to prepare food? Where's the time to eat together as a family, which we tend to, I think, should be a priority. So all of that is happening. So some households are being able to do that, even despite all of those issues that might be going on. So what about nutrition knowledge? Well, this is a tricky one. The study that we just did, we found that nutrition knowledge between food insecure and food secure households was different, and it was significantly different. And that kind of went to my little heart, what's going on here? Have a think about it though, and I looked at the literature a little bit. And sure, there's evidence that nutrition knowledge among families living with disadvantages is low, but especially around the nutrition categories, not the food categories, but the nutrition categories. Disadvantaged families tend to relate more to the foods and the impact the foods will have on external appearance, while families on higher incomes relate to the nutritional values of food in terms of their health benefits. So we need to just be mindful that the way families understand and appreciate nutritional value may be different. It doesn't necessarily make it wrong, it's just a different way of valuing foods. So I think we need to unpack that difference in nutrition knowledge a little bit more as well. So what are our responses to food insecurity in high-income countries? They're predominantly neoliberal approaches. In other words, our governments tend to be neoliberal. We have a very strong focus on personal responsibility. We need to make sure that it's an individual's responsibility that they're eating, and that what they're eating is healthy and maximising their health. We tend to also think about the deserving poor. We're more than happy to help you if you're coming to the party. You know, if you're actually actively seeking employment, if you're actually actively doing the things that the hoops that the government tells you to jump through in order to get your benefit, then you're more deserving of our assistance. There's a little bit of an undercurrent that low-income families just need to manage their resources better. And then we relate disadvantage to low income. Well, we also have deprivation. We also have, which we tend to measure with a scale of essential items in a household. They vary from country to country. In Australia, it might be that you have a separate bedroom for every child, that you have blankets on the bed for every child, and that you might be able to go on a holiday at least once a year, once or twice, once every 2 years. Social exclusion, and then you have the capabilities framework, which is basically the failure of society to provide the opportunities. I would argue that food insecurity is the failure of society to provide the opportunities for families. This is acute at Centrelink in Australia. Centrelink is where you pick up your welfare, you organise your welfare payments. So then we have the charitable approach, and you know, we've got Food Bank, we've got Oz Harvest, we've got Second Bite. Food Bank has typical food bank foods, predominantly energy dense, nutrient poor foods. Oz Harvest and Second Bite are food rescue, predominantly fresh food. Woolworths and Coles support all of these organisations. We've got a duopoly in Australia. We only have two main supermarket chains. So they're basically all of their leftover food goes to these organisations, and from doing that they reduce their waste bill, and the waste is then actually on-sold, if you like, to the NGOs that pick up the food at the end. So they get a bit of a halo effect. They're good corporate citizens, they're doing a wonderful job, they're reducing food waste, fantastic, and feeding poor people at the same time. Aren't they wonderful? You know, good nutrition, though, shouldn't be something that's reliant on acts of charity. And Graham Richards, you know, he's very much in this area and has actually critiqued this whole charitable approach, you know, quite well and markedly. But it's nice because it's still opening the door for personal responsibility. The other thing that the charitable approach does is it's essentially a needs-based approach. I have got to go to those agencies and go, excuse me, sir, can I please have some food? And then I've got to go back again if I run out again. And then I've got to figure out the system, because if I go to one agency twice in 1 week, heaven help you, I've got to figure out which agencies I can go to. So I meet the criteria and I can actually secure food. I tend to think that families do that first. It's the last thing they do. They wait until they've exhausted every possible thing that they can do before they actually go to a food relief agency. It doesn't necessarily fit with the rights-based approach. It fails to return beneficiaries to a state of food self-reliance. It fails to maintain human dignity. But in attempting to adopt a more rights-based approach, so we want to empower people to prepare their own food, those agencies tend to go, well, we create supportive enabling environments, which equals building personal skills, which are cooking programs. So we go, we assume that all of your families that are coming to get food have a knowledge and skills deficit, and so we'll link access to food, nutrition education with budgeting and cooking skills. Just what I said before is that most of those families are extraordinarily food literate. So the question is, are we empowering individuals or resolving food insecurity through individualising responsibility still? You all know Valerie. She says, you know, food insecurity isn't solved by giving somebody a bag of food, and I would argue, nor is it solved by showing someone how to cook that bag of food. You're not going to get to some of those underlying issues around food insecurity just by showing people how to cook it. So these are some examples that we have in Australia. So we've got the Food Sense program, which is teaching people how to cook on a budget. There's Food Mate, which was a program from Second Bite. Then you have financial counselling. Red Cross have healthy eating. All these about saying, look, come and get food from us. Food Bank runs Food Sense in Australia, and we'll teach you how to cook on a budget, because you're obviously not doing that properly. So what we have here, and what we're potentially guilty of, is voluntary failure. So there's a potential, which is a potential weakness of the non-for-profit sector, and I would argue a potential weakness of some of the food literacy programs that are within charitable organisations. So this is from Salomon, who says we have philanthropic insufficiency, we're actually unable to generate enough adequate, reliable funding to meet the demand for services. Particularism, some subgroups of the population may not be adequately represented. Paternalism, this is what we're particularly guilty of. Those with the greatest power and resources define the community need, and then make decisions regarding what services those people need, causing a dependent relationship. We've got amateurism, we've got volunteers without medical training doing that kind of work. So this gives you an example. You know, royal family, you know, cooking programs offer a lovely, good photo opportunity for royal families. It's a good thing to come and look at. We'll watch you coming and cook. You know, Jamie Oliver did the same thing with Restaurant 15. But I really like this quote. Like, I went to the youth service class, they were making muffins, and I was like, excuse me, I don't have an oven, right? This has like 11 ingredients in it, and I don't have an oven or a cake tray, or like, what's wrong with you? Why are you teaching homeless people And when you read it, you go, oh, duh, of course. But that's what's going on. And this is the food sense program. So, us, white, middle-class people go, gee, you should be spending 6/10 of your budget on the healthy part of the pyramid, 3/10 of your budget on the, eat moderately, and only 1/10 of your budget on the least group. And if you're not doing that, you're not doing it properly. Well, let's go along to some of the high-income families and have a little look in their trolleys and just have a look and see what they're shopping for. So one of the things that I encourage my students to do is to suspend judgment and to remember that if you're talking to a family that might say, we drink beer and have pizza on a Friday night, and you might go, terrible, you need to cut out the beer and cut down the pizza. It's just the same as someone saying, I drink champagne and eat camembert cheese on a Friday night. Nutritionally, exactly the same. Probably less likely to say to the person, we'll probably just go, just have cut back a little bit on the champagne, maybe not have as much cheese. So we've got to be careful about the judgments that we're overlaying on these. This food sense to me is a prime example of paternalism. Do what I say, not what I do. So what is that relationship then between food security and food literacy? Well, for me, food security is about providing appropriately distributed, sustainable opportunities to access that fundamental commodity which is food. Food literacy is being able to, at an individual and community level, take advantage of those opportunities. So what we might see is that food literate individuals living in food insecure situations are potentially more likely to be able to reach that certainty, choice and pleasure element for longer periods of time until the resources are no longer available. So if you think about our young lady living under the bridge, she was able to, she would say she was food secure. She wasn't food insecure. She was actually using all the resources at her disposal to feed herself and her family. So food literacy, therefore, has the potential to ameliorate some aspects of food insecurity by increasing resilience and maximising the use of available resources. It could be a key to maximising food security for a limited amount of time. The cautionary caveat is that food literacy is context dependent. In situations of deprivation and disadvantage, you're unable to improve the quality or quantity of food if there are no means to grow it or it's not available. So if that food's not available or accessible, then no amount of food literacy is going to change that. And you can't prepare food if you have no stable housing or the equipment's not available. So, those underlying social determinants are really key. The other cautionary caveat is that if we just have a focus on food literacy as the way to improve food security, we're potentially masking, putting a band-aid over the social security and food security systems failures. So I like to say that, we're trying to put a band-aid over a weeping sore. The sore underneath is ulcerating and it's getting worse, and we're putting a food literacy band-aid over the top of it. So we need to fix the ulcer underneath before, and then food literacy, as it may stick on, it may stay. So what do we need to be advocating for then? We need to be looking at adequate income. So that might be a different system. It might be a universal income. It might be basic income guarantee. It might be, I think it was called MINCOM. Was it in Canada? Yeah. Something that actually makes sure that people have a dignified access to an appropriate income. In Australia, we need to definitely strengthen the welfare safety net. So in Australia, we've always argued that our welfare safety net is enough. New Start allowance, which is an allowance that people, newly unemployed people get, is not adequate. It's not enough to feed yourself with and maintain a rental accommodation. In Australia, we need a national anti-poverty or poverty eradication or poverty alleviation strategy. We have none. In the 1980s, Bob Hawke said, no child will live in poverty within 3 years. Well, that's not happened. And I've got Go Canada, because you've just had the announcement of a national poverty strategy, anti-poverty strategy. We need housing affordability. We need energy affordability. We need water affordability. We need food affordability. Now in Australia, the fresh food does not have the 10% goods and services tax attached to it. So then they say, well, fresh food is subsidised by 10%. But the research is showing that it has to be a minimum of 20% before you see a shift in purchasing power. And we definitely need monitoring and surveillance. If we don't know it's there, we won't be able to change it. So we need annual monitoring and surveillance for food insecurity. So what about the food literacy aspect? All right, well, if we conceptualise food literacy beyond the individual and the select element, we need food labelling that's accessible, understandable and empowering regardless of the ability to read. So we've just gone to a traffic light model in Australia. Nobody understands. I can't even understand how it works. There's some complex algorithms behind it. And when you look at a food, you go, that Nutrigrain, that's got a green light. It's 30% sugar. I'm going, how does that work? But we need to have a food labelling system that's accessible to everybody. We need to be thinking about the prepared thing, and I think we actually need to embed food skills, not just nutrition knowledge, into school. That means that everybody, those attending school, we've got to think about those that are not attending school or dropping out of school, but we'll get that from prep right through to leaving school, some basic food skills and some basic food literacy. I like to, Shokyuku, which is the Japanese model, which is a food education, which is enacted by law, is a paddock-to-plate approach or farm-to-fork approach, and they've got preparing foods in classrooms, eating together, going out and visiting the farms, and really strengthening that food culture. And then we need to promote a celebratory food culture. This element for me is always missing, that pleasure element, that eating together, that commensality that we can actually all come together as communities, share food and enjoy the consumption of food. So that goes beyond the individual, that's the broader kind of perspectives. So what else? We need a whole population approach, so rebuilding that food literacy within schools. We need to stop privileging cooking from scratch, that cooking from basic ingredients. That's not an option for many people. We need to factor in the time and convenience. So how can I make? I've just responded to a blog that said, cooking from scratch is a good way for food sustainability in local foods. It's great. Not many people can afford that. So if I can take a jar of pasta sauce and some pasta and a bag of frozen vegetables, is that any less healthy than cooking that from scratch? Probably not. So we need to stop privileging cooking from scratch. We need to think about the whole food system. We need to take an assets-based approach, not a deficit-based approach. Let's work with what people are good at and what they can do. And we need to co-create with the recipients, not just sit in our ivory towers and go, I think I know what you need. We need to really work with our communities to actually figure out, co-create the responses together. And that's the broad responses as well as the individual kind of getting down to the community level responses. So they're my solutions for integrating food security and food literacy. So on a final note, I'm just going to end with 2 points. Pat Colley was an Australian social nutritionist. She wrote this back in 1992. Now to me that doesn't seem so long ago, but it's actually quite a while ago now. So she said, stereotyping low-income families from the left as helpless victims of the system, or from the right as irresponsible practitioners of poor dietary habits, is out of step with the available evidence and demeaning when examined against the experiences of families. And I would say that's still true. And the other one is that the nexus between food literacy and food security reminds us that the reconfiguration of nutritional health as a biomedical problem cannot be divorced from the social context, nor should what are failures of the political system be turned into problems of deviance or moral order. So thank you. I'll leave it on that note. So thank you. And I'm happy to take comments, questions.
Yeah, questions.
Hi. So that was a really fascinating presentation. Lots of really amazing points there. One thing that I found quite fascinating, it seems to be, it's interesting that Australia and Canada, we tend to have a lot of commonalities between our two countries. And one thing that I've sort of noticed across the board, and you sort of reaffirmed that for me when you were speaking of it, was one of the first slides that you had mentioned, and you brought up a percentage of people that use and actually utilize food banks, and it's relatively low in comparison to those who are actually going hungry or choosing to omit a meal. And I think we can all understand the nuances as to why that might be, various reasons. And sort of to branch off of that, stemming towards the matter of food literacy, one word or one, I guess, phrase that I've heard sort of thrown around is something called sweat equity. And in regards to, and this might be a potential solution, community involvement, not necessarily individualistic, but community engagement in community gardens, and having people come in and sweat equity, come in, do the work, leave at the end of the day. Although it does sort of go against some things that you said about cooking from scratch. But one thing that I found interesting is that kind of takes out the need for that threshold level of income in that regard and in that sense. So obviously there's a lot of other components that would be required for a person to have the time to come and do that and come home and cook. I understand. But I think that regardless, that's an interesting thing to work on, develop, research, and find ways, because it tackles so many different walls down, having food literacy become more prominent, teaching people to cook with food and reestablishing that connection, and also promoting local, and as opposed to globalized food systems, becoming more self-sufficient on a still collective, but a more local level. So I'm not sure if that's a comment or a question, but just something to note. And if you have anything that you'd like to say, that very key here.
Look, I think there's no one solution. I think we need to be looking at a broad range of different things. I suppose what I get a little bit nervous about is when we go, oh, we can have a community garden, and we can come to that garden and do work in that garden, or we can have local food systems, which tend to be a little bit more expensive than like a globalised food system. I'm not against local food systems, and I'm not against community gardens, but I think when we're developing those, we just need to keep, as you've rightfully said, in the back of our minds, what's going on here. Why don't I have all these families come into the community garden? And usually the response is, oh, goddamn families again. We put all this stuff together, we make these opportunities, and nobody ever turns up. God, bad families again. Where in fact I'm actually working 3 jobs. I actually can't get there. I've got to do childcare. I've got to, there's all sorts of other things going on in their lives. So I think if we've got to think about multiple solutions that might fit some families well and other families not so well, if there's opportunities and choices, then we're in a much better position.
Right?
Yeah, it seems to me from the policy question here, that's sort of my thinking, how I think of these questions is there a causal effect of food literacy on food insecurity? And so does improving food literacy affect food insecurity? Which in the kind of research I do sounds like the kind of question you can answer empirically, right, in a quantitative, and either in an experimental setting, or so once you control for all the other stuff, which is income basically is the most important, right? So once you control for that other stuff, is there a causal effect of increasing food literacy? And I'm wondering, I kind of thought you might talk about some of that. Is there literature that does that? I assume there is. I don't know what does that literature say?
Well, Joyce might be able to help you. I'm not sure that there is much literature that actually looks at food literacy and food security and that relationship. We haven't really got to a point where we can measure food literacy yet. So at the moment, there's lots of work going on internationally about what are we actually measuring when we measure food literacy. Are we measuring confidence to cook? Yeah, probably not so much. Are we measuring, the ability to cook an egg versus cook a curry? A lot of the measures are actually coming back down to that cooking question. So the large part with that kind of relationship is how do we measure food literacy? And people internationally are working on that particular question. But I think we can. It seems like a no-brainer, if you like. That yes, there is some sort of relationship. And I think again, what we can see is that food literacy will potentially increase the time you are food secure until all resources have been depleted. So if I've got no money, and if I have and the food's not available with the income I'm on, doesn't matter how privileged I am, I'm still not going to be able to make something. But it's something that I think is becoming more of a research question. And the first thing is to try and figure out what we're actually measuring when we're measuring food literacy.
More question?
Oh, two tricky ones.
Here we go.
Do you get pushback ever when you talk about things in regional terms like food procurement in non-monetary ways from supermarkets or things that sort of go against a neoliberal or paternalistic idea of how people navigating food systems or literacy ought to be? And then I'm sure it's not just you who sort of does research or think in those terms, so what does it look like to not just focus on navigating the pushback, or, how does the conversation stay neutral? Like, how do you do that?
It is really difficult to keep that neutral and to keep it, especially in the neoliberal environment, because people want to label really, and they want to have that power dynamic. Usually when I'm in these forums, it's not a problem because I'm with like-minded people and everyone kind of talks very respectfully. When I'm in more kind of diverse forums, I usually get that question about gambling, smoking, drinking, and it's like, really? When I did the work around food security in university students, and I've got a lot of media, the pushback was, yeah, but that's just a rite of passage. All students need to starve while they're actually doing their degree because that builds character. They're spending all their money on alcohol and new Nikes and their mobile phones, aren't they? Actually, no, they're spending their money on rent and books and getting to their jobs rather than those other things. So I don't think I've got an answer for you. It's up to us to actually keep doing that and to keep really being advocates because it's having said that, I'm trying to figure out ways of actually framing food security for neoliberal governments. So the other part of the work that I didn't show was we've actually working with some social marketers who have come up with typologies. From a marketing perspective, that's what they do. And they've come up with 3 typologies. They've come up with the, so I can remember this, they've come up with the personal responsibility, social justice, and participatory. So you've got personal responsibility at one end, you've got social justice at the other end, and you've got participatory people in the middle. They're also politicians. So how do we frame food security for people that are around personal responsibility? How do we frame it for those people that are in that participatory? And how do we frame it for people in social justice? To try and get them to think about food security and the policy actions that need to happen that don't go against their political ideology. So that's an exploring work that we want to do. Is kind of, we've figured out the typologies and how to reframe it so that we can talk about it in their language, even though I'll be selling my soul, a part of my soul when I talk about it, in the personal responsibility frame. I've got to actually do that because the government's not listening to me. We can't even get it, we can't even get animal monitoring. It's not a problem. So I've got to figure out how to talk to the government I've got at the moment to say, come on guys, how are we going to do this?
Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
As individuals, what can we be doing to move towards a more food secure society?
Please, go ahead.
Let me open that up to everybody. What do you think as individuals you could be doing to move towards a more food secure society? The trickle-down effect doesn't work. Right? As middle class people, predominantly middle class, we're all here in a university setting, so I'm going to assume predominantly middle class. Certainly in Australia you would be. goes, oh well, if everybody was ate locally and went organic, and then it all trickled down, people in the lower income areas will start doing the same thing. That doesn't work. But that's not to say you shouldn't do those things, and you shouldn't promote the community gardens and advocate for those in your local areas, and really purchase those items. I'd be, as an individual, the charitable stuff's not working. I don't think it's working, but it's the only thing that's there. So we don't have it. There's nothing. So if I'm hungry and I don't have that there, then I've got nowhere else to go. So in some ways, supporting some of those agencies who are providing that emergency food relief, I would say is a good thing. But also they're moving it towards something that's more sustainable in the long term, whatever that might be. But it's really hard to kind of know, well, what can you do? Write a letter to your local MP. It's a problem, it's an issue. We need to talk about it. Get it into the media. Again, trying not to kind of go, this is, those bad, immoral, poor people don't have anything to eat, but really, thinking about, well, how can we do this from an assets point of view?
Thank you very much. We're very proud of the Human Rights Museum. It's the only national museum outside of our nation's capital. But maybe I could ask you to kindly critique it for its value toward your theme. Did you have any satisfaction at the Human Rights Museum for the area that you're passionate about, which I think is also very important?
Interestingly, there were lots of food references in the museum. The first one around food security, was one of them. There was lots of talk about the migrant farm workers as well, and from that food systems perspective. There was the Bread and Roses campaign, which, can't quite remember the context of that, but, but there's lots of food references. Perhaps we didn't have enough of the reality of the current situation, of what it's like to live with disadvantage currently. We said it before, there are amazing similarities between Australia and Canada. Amazing similarities. And our histories are equally disturbing from our human rights perspective.
May I have a follow-up question? Just, you made a comment there about the reality of disadvantage or whatever. That's an interesting comment, because I think the reality of disadvantage has changed so much in my lifetime. And is that something that resonates with the neoliberal leaders? Is that a point that you're trying to make? Because I hear all the time, well, I had a summer job, I paid for my university. Yeah. Well, if you do the math now, it doesn't quite add up.
That's right.
So the reality of disadvantage is different now. There's also all the other things in our society that have changed.
Yeah.
But perhaps you want to make a comment on it, but you don't need to.
Well, I think that's
I
why.
already had my one question.
I think that's why we need to conceptualise disadvantage in multiple ways. People kind of call that low income as being disadvantaged, but the deprivation index is a really good example of how we can conceptualise it in a different way. The problem I've got with that deprivation index is that in the UK, the index actually encompasses having food to eat and having at least 2 meals to eat a day, with one of those meals including meat. In Australia, we conceptualise it as having at least 1 meal a day. That's it. I'm going, that's not quite enough, I would have thought. And then we've got social exclusion. We've got a range of metrics or constructs that contribute to disadvantage that we need to really explore and unpack. Government tends to think about it as being on the poverty line, and that's not the full depth and breadth of disadvantage.
Well, and we actually don't have an official level of poverty. That's part of the new strategy. So I'm going to say thank you because it is 4:30. But if people want to stick around and ask questions, we're going to hang around. So thank you, Danielle.
You're welcome.
To turn the recorder off.
Just give me a